All right. Welcome to another episode of Exit Liquidity. Episode 61, I want to say. Today we got Sam from Sturdy Finance. Sam, thanks for joining us, man. Excited to have you on.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Awesome. So, Sturdy is a platform that allows you to create money markets for just about any token. They got a lot of cool stuff cooking that I think is pretty relevant to like a lot of the narratives that are popping up here and there today. So we'll definitely be getting into that further down. To start out, would love to hear a little bit about you, Sam, and kind of just what brought you into crypto. I guess what brought you into crypto to start out, and then from there, what brought you to end up at Sturdy or to end up starting Sturdy.
Yeah, absolutely. So I got into crypto through the back door of cryptography. It was something I was really interested in throughout high school and college. So I was sort of aware with kind of the technical underpinnings since I guess it was 6 years ago or so. And then during DeFi summer, I guess I like stumbled across like Pancake Swap and Compound, and just fell in love with the application side. And started using it myself. And at the time, I had taken a leave of absence from school since it was also during COVID. And even though I was working other jobs, I was kind of finding myself spending all of my time obsessing and thinking about and using DeFi, and realized that it was kind of just something that I had to get involved in. And so yeah, I did, and this was I guess early 2022 or late 2021.
Nice. Yeah. I don't think I know many people who started out in cryptography. That's pretty interesting. I always consider that to be, or at least from what I knew about it, to be like, I don't know, a pretty based like profession. I don't really understand too much about its practicality outside of like blockchain. What were you like learning about back then? What was like the practical like applications of it then?
Yep. So my work was mostly in homomorphic encryption, which is the study of cryptography, specifically in the context of being able to perform operations over encrypted data. And incidentally, it turns out this is really relevant for AI because let's say you have a data set that is encrypted, right? Maybe some like medical data, and you want to learn something about it, right? You want to perform some machine learning operations over this data, but it's encrypted. Uh, and homomorphic encryption allows you to do exactly this, right? It allows you to perform certain mathematical operations over encrypted data without having to decrypt it. And so that was my background. And yeah, it sort of by accident has now, become really applicable to, I guess, crypto and a lot of the AI projects you see coming out, and even touched a little bit of what we're doing at Sturdy as well.
Yeah, we'll act like we know what those terms mean for now, but that's pretty interesting stuff for some people to research. For everyone that comes on the show, the show is called the Exit Liquidity. We have our kind of go-to question that highlights your experience in the space. If you could tell us a exit liquidity story that you've had that highlights your experience in the ecosystem.
Where I was the exit liquidity.
Yeah.
Oh man, yeah, this is a really bad one, but I got liquidated longing USDC on the that DPEG. I don't know if you guys remember. I mean, this was a year ago maybe, but when USDC depegged during the all of those bank runs, yeah, I got liquidated on that, which is just the most. I think that's about as embarrassing as it gets. Um, so yeah, I mean, I very rarely do any kind of like trading or anything like that, and I guess that sort of underscored why. Because yeah, I'm not very good at it, so I kind of just stick to holding one or two things, not touching it too much, and then obviously spending most of my time on sturdy.
Mm. Yeah, that is pretty embarrassing. I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah.
It's a good one though. Like I respect the creativity of the trade. I find that the best builders tend to be the worst traders. So maybe there's a good correlation there. Um, cool. So shifting over to like Sturdy a little bit, I'm curious as to like what, because going from where you were like in cryptography, dealing more with like encryption and more mathematical concepts, what kind of led you to this idea of, or at least brought you more interested into money markets from like day one? What was like the early vision kind of like?
Yeah, for sure. So I think when first started using apps, a lot of it was mostly DEXs and money markets at that point. I thought that the money markets were naturally a little bit more interesting. It was clear that there's kind of a real application there, right? It's not just speculation, it's actually about enabling users to earn yield or borrow. And so for me, there was just a kind of like, okay, there's actually something here, right? There's a way that this could really grow and be a huge market. And so I was looking at what was available at the time and realized that there was not a lot of places where you could borrow against interest bearing assets. So you recently had like Anchor launching on Luna, and there were a lot of mistakes with that design. But one thing they did that was really interesting was you could use staked assets as collateral. So you could use whatever like the staked Luna was. They even allowed you to use bridged staked ETH. And at the time, there really wasn't anywhere where you could borrow against staked ETH on Ethereum, and there weren't many places where you could borrow against LP tokens on Ethereum. And so we started out with that, with being a kind of traditional money market in terms of our architecture, so similar to Aave or Compound, with a permissioned pooled model where governance onboarded certain assets and then all users can kind of borrow and deposit to that pot. But being able to specifically use like interest bearing assets as collateral. And we launched first on Phantom. This was during the solidly phase when there was a lot of hype and inflows there. And then a couple months after that, we launched on Ethereum, being able to use Curve LPs and similar assets as collateral.
Hmm. Yeah, I didn't realize you guys were on Phantom first. That's definitely an interesting choice. What prompted that back then? And when was this actually?
Yeah, so this was March 2022. At the
Okay.
time, I mean, there was a lot of excitement around Phantom. I mean, this was kind of like Andre, launching solidly. And so the yields were crazy good. And we figured that being kind of a first mover there in terms of being able to borrow against those would be really advantageous. And it was. We did pretty well while solidly was popping off. Obviously, as that sort of declined, we realized that it didn't make sense just to constrain and kind of confine ourselves to there. And so that was why we shifted. And by June, so just a couple months later, we were live on Ethereum, and that's pretty much been our main focus ever since.
Yeah, interesting. I think I was on the Phantom kind of wave. I think a little bit more than Ollie was back then. It was an interesting time. The Solidly Forest Tomb. I mean, there's like a bunch of weird stuff happening there. The Could you explain a little bit more on the architecture of Sturdy, kind of how it's set up, how the lending and things work?
Yeah, for sure. So we launched V2 in January, just this past January. And so we basically architected it from the ground up. And maybe as a little bit of context, the kind of existing landscape before we launched V2 could really be split into two paradigms. On the one hand, you've got protocols like Aave and Compound, where governance enshrines a set of collateral assets at the protocol level, right? So if you're depositing USDC on, let's say, Aave V3, you're exposed to a fixed set of assets. Everyone's exposed to them. Governance makes that decision. That's kind of one end, right? And this is great in terms of the user experience, super easy to use, really deep liquidity. Where it's not so great is in terms of the permissionlessness, right? Governance is deciding where you can and can't allocate your money, what you can and can't borrow against. And so there's some disadvantages there. But on the other end, you have isolated lending protocols like Silo Finance, like FraxLend. And those are great because pretty much anyone can deploy a market. And it's permissionless. You have every pool is isolated. So there's a single collateral asset and a single lending asset in each. But one of the big drawbacks is that you have this liquidity fragmentation, right? If you have 10 different USDC pools, all of a sudden, as a user, it's really difficult to navigate that, right? And so maybe you want to deposit to five of them, but now that's five deposit transactions, five withdrawal transactions, five, rebalances every time you want to move your assets between them to improve your yields. And so what Sturdy does is we try to bridge the gap between those two models with a two-layer approach. So at the base layer, we're pretty similar to isolated lending protocols, right? Where you can imagine a bunch of isolated pairs that each have a single lending asset and a single collateral asset. What we've done is built on top, we have these vaults, which are we call aggregators, that whitelist silos from the first layer. So let's say you're looking at the ETH pools on our platform. There are maybe 5 or 6. If you want to just deposit to 3 of them, you can spin up an aggregator that will automatically feed liquidity to those 3 silos. And then so in that way, you kind of get the UX benefits of an Aave or a compound, and that it's one deposit operation, one withdrawal operation, great kind of optimized yields, and you still get the permissionlessness in that you can have pools for any asset. There's no systematic risk, and so we're able to support a long tail of assets. I mean, we have a ton of LRTs that you can borrow against, like LRT LPs, and really any asset you can imagine, we're able to support through Sturdy because it's not like we're adding incremental risk to existing users. It's just creating a new pool that users can opt into if they want.
Yeah, and for the aggregators specifically, could you dive into kind of how they work? I know there's like some I know Yearn at V3 is involved there. I know that there's like some CK tech inside of that. Could you describe that a little bit more?
Yep. So in terms of the code itself, they're Yearn v3 vaults, which it's sort of like ERC 4626. We think of it as a primitive that's battle tested, audited. In terms of the allocation process, right? Like let's say you have an aggregator that has 4 silos whitelisted, right? How do you decide if it is $10 million how to allocate that between silos? This is something that we've been thinking about for a really long time. It's something that Yearn, their contributors think about. Morpho, I know that they're thinking about this as well. And yeah, so there's a couple different approaches that we've tried, right? One is just manual allocation. So you have managers for the aggregators that decide on their own, hey, we should put 5 million into this isolated lending pair, 3 million into this one, and so on. This works, right? I mean, it's sufficient, but I don't think it's great in that you're not getting optimal yields. It's still pretty centralized. And so we have some aggregators like our Curve USD aggregator managed by Llama Risk, which follow this, and I think it works well. But to me, there's a lot of room for improvement there. And so we're actually launching a BitTensor subnet that's going to solve this. And the vision here is rather than having a centralized party write it or even write an algorithm that will determine the allocation, instead, wouldn't it be great if anyone could propose an allocation and then the best one would be automatically used? That was what we have been thinking about and sort of imagining, could we build this on our own a while back? But BitTensor actually provides the perfect rails for us to do this because they have natural incentivization mechanisms and an infrastructure that's basically perfect for this sort of use case.
When you say the best route, how do you define like the best? Is it just I mean, it can't just be the highest yield, right? There's other risk parameters involved as well. What does that process look like for determining the trade-off?
Yeah, great question. So initially, it will be the best yield within certain parameters, right? So miners, who are sort of the users who are coming up with the allocations, will receive information about the aggregator and the underlying strategies it can deposit to, the interest rate curves for each, that sort of thing. They'll also get certain information about different constraints. So a constraint might be for this lending pair, you can only deposit $3 million at max, right? And so they'll know that they have to respect that. And if they don't, they'll get penalized within the reward mechanism. Over time, though, we want to move to something a little bit more predictive, right? So instead of saying, what is the best yield at the moment that you make the allocation, we might say, what is going to be the best yield 7 days from now? And so we're adding more of a predictive machine learning element to it. And that's kind of the goal, is to roll that out over time and have protocols like us or anyone else that wants to tap into the subnet, because the goal is for it to not just be us, but for this to be something that any project or application can tap into, to be able to specify, hey, this is how I want the predictions to be handled, and here's how I want to score them.
Okay, I see. Yeah, that makes sense. I'm curious to go back to the BitTensor subnet. I think that's probably what's on a lot of people's minds these days. What's the process of registering one of those been like for you guys? Because I I can't think of any other DeFi protocols that come to mind that are leveraging something like that. Um, so I'd be interested to hear what that process is like, whether it's challenging, whether you feel like it'll be worth it in the long run, or how big of a role it'll end up playing. Just a little bit more specifics there.
Yeah, absolutely. So BitTensor has 32 subnets. If you want, we could also talk a little bit more about like how BitTensor works and the subnets as well. Yeah, sure. So happy to go into that. I guess first, maybe for the folks who don't have that context. Um, as an example, right? I'll just step back and say, let's say you wanted to build a model that predicted the price of Bitcoin, right? Seems like a pretty cool thing to do. If you had that, it would be worth a lot. How would you go about building that? A model that predicted the price of Bitcoin? Well, you could try to build the model yourself. You could train it. You could look at the literature out there, all the research. Maybe you'd look at like different linear regression models that are publicly available. You might see if like GCP or AWS has some kind of existing model you could leverage. And so there's all these different kind of centralized approaches that you could either do yourself if you're a developer. Maybe you could try to purchase something off the shelf. But one option that you could also say is rather than trying to build it yourself, is you could outsource and crowdsource it. So by what I mean by that is, wouldn't it be great if you could have hundreds of different developers competing and rewarding the best ones, such that if they were able to consistently predict the price of Bitcoin, let's say 7 days from now, they would receive some kind of reward, maybe on a daily or hourly basis. And in that way, what you could do is incentivize people to build the best prediction model, kind of over time. That the best ones would rise to the top, the worst would be weeded out, and you could kind of slowly refine until you actually had a really great predictive model that you could then use for your application, or that you could sell to clients, or something like that. Hopefully that makes sense, and that's exactly what BitTensor enables. Is there are 32 separate subnets, and each of them is kind of a mini competition like that, where miners compete to produce the best models, training, data, storage, really anything you can imagine. And the example I gave, the predicting the price of Bitcoin, is actually one of them. It's subnet 8 from Taushi. There's another one from Foundry that predicts the S&P 500. And so if you're like a developer, you've probably heard of Kaggle, which was acquired by Google a while back. It's very similar to that. It's kind of a decentralized version of that in some respect. So yeah, that's what BitTensor is at a high level. In terms of the process for us registering, first we launched on testnet a couple weeks ago, making sure that all of the code looks good, having lots of users go through it, test it, go through the installation, write their own models. That's been going pretty well, and so yeah, I think we'll probably be good to register on mainnet. Hopefully in the near future, and then at that point, users will actually be able to receive Tau for writing the best models, or validating that other users have written them, and sort of scoring them based on the rules that as subnet owners we set.
Okay. Yeah, that context definitely helps. I think the price prediction subnet is definitely like a pretty cogent example. This is like a little bit off topic, tangentially related. Just from like going over your docs and from hearing you speak about some stuff, it seems like decentralization is definitely a pretty important part of like Sturdy's long term roadmap. I'm wondering, as far as I understand it, there's not a ton of interoperability between the EVM and BitTensor. So when you have a product that leverages both of them, obviously the two of them have to communicate through some forum, some medium. Does that introduce any additional centralization concerns?
Yeah, for sure. And so the initial form factor for the integration will be an API that aggregator managers can query. So they can say, hey, here's my information, send it to the subnet. Subnet will return an allocation, and they can kind of manually set that up. But absolutely, to your point, what we want to move towards is a totally automated and decentralized version of that, either through an info bridge or some kind of oracle that removes any kind of a central middle layer. So yeah, I agree, and I think this will be something that a lot of projects can leverage. I don't think we'll be the last project on EVM to realize that there is this really great kind of incentive alignment protocol that BitTensor has built out. So yeah, I would absolutely expect that once we've built out the info bridge infrastructure, or work with other partners to provide that, that you'll see a ton of projects taking advantage. I know that TensorPlex and a couple of other folks are working on like stake Tau on the EVM. So my guess is that you'll see similar projects to that work to leverage this.
Hmm. Do you know, uh, are you kind of expecting or have you been hearing of these projects leveraging the BitTensor network specifically, or are there other like solutions also in place?
For the
I
projects that are doing like stake Tau, or
For I guess just for DeFi protocols looking to integrate some sort of DeFi component similar to how you guys are planning to do so.
yeah, for like DeFi protocols doing AI. I mean, yeah, some of them are doing just like off-chain stuff where they'll say they're doing like AI kind of in quotes, and then have it on some back end. To my knowledge, there aren't a lot of people that have made the connection yet, but yeah, I definitely expect that to change. I think it's such a no-brainer. It's something that we've been talking to a lot of the other projects I mentioned that we think will leverage the subnet, um, who have wanted to build like a marketplace for allocations, right, to power the centralized yield optimizers. So I absolutely expect that. You'll see a lot more projects adopt something like this in the future.
Yeah. For these kind of aggregators or AI kind of decision makers, I know they're basically already incentivized through the BitTensor ecosystem. Will there be kind of, well, so first, can you explain the communication between like those, I want to call them agents, and the decision making on the pools? Are they kind of just predicting, are they predicting one aspect, or are they kind of actually making the decisions on where liquidity is going?
Yeah, so they are getting information about the pools, right? All the different interest rate models for each aggregator, the pools that's allowed to deploy to. Then, based on that data, they're saying, "Hey, here's what I think the best allocation should be." So, you told me that your aggregator has $10 million and can deposit to pools A, B, and C. I think you should put 4 million into A, 3 into B, and 3 into C, right? Something like that, based
So
on
what's
their
the
custom. Sorry.
Yeah. So what's the infrastructure, and this may be obvious, but what's the infrastructure that they're using to gather information about DeFi pools?
Yep. So there are what's called validators who are sending information to agents about the pools. The validators themselves are getting the information from anyone who queries their API, which can be, it could be like a protocol like ours. It can be an aggregator manager. It can really be anyone. And they're also generating their own synthetic data, which they're using as kind of a way to test the miners or the agents, to sort of weed them out over time, when since the stream of requests that they're going to be getting organically isn't going to be constant from day one.
So does Sturdy itself have any role in deciding which pools are fed into that and are fed to these agents on the data side? Or is
Yeah,
it
so
any
the
pool?
yeah, so the way it will work in practice is that aggregator managers, who, so let's say I mentioned Llama Risk. There's other projects who have pools on Sturdy. Let's say they want to tap into this, right? What they would do is they would query this, what initially will be an API, with all their pool data, and then they'll get back an answer. That will be kind of the day one MVP solution. But what we want in the future is this to be an oracle that the protocol itself would query, right? So instead of having this API middleware, the protocol would make a request to an info bridge or an oracle that inputs about this information. Then the oracle would have a go between to the validators API on the BitTensor network, who's querying the miners, and then it kind of propagates backwards. So backwards to the validators to the oracle or info bridge, which then commits it directly to the EVM. And then our protocol would then take that information that's committed on chain and use it in real time.
Interesting. And Just for like any maybe DeFi protocols that are watching, on like a scale of 1 to 10, how hard was this to come up with and like so far implement?
Yeah, I mean, I would put it maybe at like a 5. I think it's different from smart contract development for sure, in that you really have to think carefully about how you're going to design your incentivization mechanism, and also making sure that it's not going to get exploited, because miners who are the agents who are writing the algorithms and submitting allocations or other data are going to try every trick they have to sort of hack the system, right, or game the system so that they can get as many incentives as possible. And so yeah, I think you have to think a little bit adversarially in that regard, which DeFi protocols are probably used to just from the smart contract security side. Our goal though is to make it so, rather than other protocols having to make their own subnet, they can very easily tap into ours. And so, I mentioned we have an API that is on our GitHub page for the subnet. But yeah, we're working on streamlining that even more so that projects can, through a UI, basically set something up to make these queries. And yeah, that's really our goal, is for this not just to be a subnet that's serving sturdy, but that serves as many protocols as possible throughout DeFi.
And so, as a subnet, what happens when you do become a subnet? I understand that the validators and the miners actually start kind of working for some real incentives, if I have that right. But what happens kind of beyond that? Is there any world where like Sturdy is incentivizing aspects of these miners or rewarding them, or is it solely BitTensor?
Yeah, so there's a couple entities at play here. There's the validators on our network who are um, sending submissions to miners and then receiving them and ranking them. The miners themselves are writing the algorithms that compute the allocations and sending them to validators. There's aggregator managers and protocols like ourselves who will be pinging the validators and getting that information. In our case, right, for the validators, we'll be paying them to do this, right? We'll basically be paying them for API access, so they're in some sense, making money and being incentivized for this. In terms of the kind of root BitTensor network itself, there's also, I guess, a meta incentivization that's going on where they're determining how many and the breakdown of incentives that goes to each subnet. So there's 32 subnets. Each of them gets a certain amount of incentives. The incentive breakdown is determined by the largest Tau stakers. And so, yeah, even within that, there's kind of this other layer of incentive alignment that's going on, where you're, as a subnet, trying to compete to get the most incentives for your subnet, so that you're able to get the miners the greatest incentives, and that sort of attracts the most miner talent, and in turn powers whatever your application is.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm kind of want to jump in here a little bit. I'm curious as to dig into those incentives a little bit, and kind of if if there is, and if there is, how exactly do the incentives like kind of connect between sturdy and tau there? Because obviously, um, if you're a performance subnet, you should be earning a good amount of tau going to your miners, as far as I understand it. And in the same vein, you obviously, Sturdy being a DeFi protocol, you guys have incentives for your users, and you can leverage the token as a way to help bootstrap. Is there any overlap that will be there between those two? Like, is there any scenario where the Tau incentives end up somehow benefiting Sturdy holders or Sturdy users, and vice versa?
Yeah, I mean, that's not something that we have announced or anything or done to date. I mean, yeah, but I think what we'll have to see in the future. I think there are some interesting potentials for overlap there. They're actually moving. I mentioned that right now it's decided by the root network, like where the emissions go. They're going to move to something a little bit more decentralized, where anyone can stake. It's called like DTau, dynamic tau, I think. And I mean, it's basically, I mean, it reminds me of like a curve type deal where, if there's more votes going to your pool, then you get more emissions. And, with Curve, you have these bribing markets set up. My guess is that there's going to be something very similar that happens here, right? Because it just makes too much sense. And, the parallels, I think, in the financialization are almost identical. And so, yeah, I think that there's a ton of really interesting possibilities to explore in the future. Sturdy, the protocol is a DAO, right? And so, ultimately, I can't speak to like anything that will happen, and so we'll see what folks come up with and what ideas they have. So, yeah, I'm really curious to see once that launches, in our governance forums and elsewhere, the sort of things that people propose.
Yeah, I think the the bit tensor stuff is very interesting. I think Ali and I are still learning about it a lot more. I think I really like this initiative. I think this is like really cool to see DeFi reach out into these kind of other ecosystems and leverage them. You guys are also on mode. Could you speak a bit more on the decision making there? And I mean the TVL there is like rising pretty quickly on the DeFi llama chart. Could you describe maybe some stuff going on there for people that haven't been paying attention?
Yeah, absolutely. So Mode is an L2. It uses the op stack. They're kind of trying to be the DeFi L2 for the op stack. And yeah, they made a proposal to launch Sturdy, to deploy Sturdy on Mode, and got a ton of positive reception. Launched there, I think a month or two ago, and yeah, as you said, the growth there has been insane. A lot of it has been from LRTs that have created markets with Sturdy, like Renzo and EtherFi. They both have markets that they've created with Sturdy, and there's so much demand for recursively borrowing against LRT. So right now, everyone's kind of scrambling to get LRT points, to get eigenlayer points, and of course, you can do that by just like holding the LRT, which is great. But one way to make it even better is if you can deposit the LRT as collateral, right? Borrow some ETH against that, put that ETH back into the LRT, then re-borrow against that, right? And so you can see where this is going. And now all of a sudden, the amount of points that it would take you a month to earn, you're earning in a couple of days, right? And so we're seeing a ton of demand for this. The borrow APRs have been nuts, like 40, 50%. And so people are looping this 10x, right? And they're paying a lot, but that's because they just want to accumulate the points, right? And so, yeah, we haven't seen any slowdown in demand for that. It's only gone up. There are a bunch of new proposals that LRT projects have posted recently. I think Kelp and Bedrock were the last I saw, and some new layer twos have also posted proposals to launch Sturdy on their networks. I think XLayer from OKX recently made one. And so, yeah, we're super excited. I think that's one of the great things about Sturdy's model is it's really modular and easy to port to different L2s and to support new assets.
Yeah, the LRT stuff has definitely been making waves. I think like the whole like points farming meta has really gone, at least me personally, a lot further than like I initially thought it would from the, I guess, from like the Blur days back when it first started making its waves. And now we have like the Pendle yield tokens, the Gearbox like 10x under collateralized leverage. Athena obviously was just an example of that being a very profitable trade for a lot of different users. And it's good to see that you guys are also like leaning into that heavily. Obviously, LRTs are a pretty big deal right now, I think. If I am a holder of Renzo ETH, Swell ETH, whichever ones you guys support, I don't have like an exact list, obviously. How can I use Sturdy with my
Yeah,
assets?
absolutely. So you can deposit your LRT to Sturdy. You can borrow ETH against it, and then you could do whatever you want with the ETH, right? One thing that a lot of users do is then they'll deposit that ETH into the LRT and then back into Sturdy and keep looping that, right? So similar to Gearbox in that regard, where you can 10x effectively your points on the same deposit. For a lot of the pools too, there's also an option to do that in a single transaction because you don't want to be spending 20 transactions worth of gas, and spending all the time to do that. So that there's kind of an automation tool built into the UI that lets you do that. And yeah, the goal is really to have that supported for as many LRTs as possible on as many chains. A lot of LRTs offer point boosts. So, like on Mode, for example, Easy ETH, which is Renzo's LRT holders, already earn 2x just for holding. And so now you're getting 10x leverage on that. Now you're earning 20x points, right? So there's just a lot of ways that you can kind of stack your points there. And yeah, I totally agree with you about the points meta. I initially was very skeptical. I didn't think it was going to take off, but I think now you're seeing basically every project go that route, which is kind of nuts.
And you guys have like a governance setup. I looked at your forum a bit. I saw X layer. I've never heard of X layer until this moment, but I've seen some proposals there. What's the governance structure like? What's the turnaround time for maybe new chains you got new chains you guys want to go to, new collateral or asset offerings? What's that like?
Yeah, so it's usually about a week all in. You generally, if someone just has a rough idea, they'll post to the discussion section. A lot of times people might have a very vague sense of, oh, I'd like to borrow like USDC against my LRT. Post a discussion section, people will share ideas there. Then once they have something a little bit more concrete, they'll post to the proposal section. Usually, we leave like 72 hours or so for people to discuss in case there's any questions, and then finally move to the snapshot vote, which yeah takes 3 days. And so all in all, if it's quick, it will take a week. Sometimes it will take months. If it's something really complex. One thing I'll add is that we right now to get anyone can deploy a pool. Like the code is open source and permissionless. So if you want to deploy a new asset, you can do it. To get whitelisted on the UI currently requires a governance proposal, but I think, from my perspective, that there's probably a future where we can eliminate that requirement and people can just, through the UI, basically create a new pool. Since there is no systematic risk, I think the main risk there is that people just like don't create honeypots, right? Like someone creates a BTC pool, but it's actually just something that they've created, and they potentially rug users. So that's really the only concern there. But projects like Ajna and Morpho have done total decentralization on the new asset listing side, and I'd love to see Sturdy move in that direction over time as well.
How do teams like them, or I guess like organizations like them or like Sturdy one day, how do you prevent against that scenario if it's an entirely decentralized process? How do you prevent like malicious collateral options from being proposed?
Yeah, and I mean that's the main challenge. I think there's a couple ways you can have links and such that show what the contract address is, and big bright letters that say, hey, make sure you check this. You can probably have like a filter that just make sure that if someone puts in BTC or ETH that you're flagging that on the UI. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think part of it too is a user education problem. Like if you're on Uniswap, right, and you search a token, there's no expectation that that's going to be a legit token, right? Like as a user, if you're just searching stuff on Uniswap, it could be a rug. Whereas on lending protocols, it's not as clear cut, right? Just because with something like Aave or Compound, that if you see USDC on Aave, okay, it's legit, right? You're not going and checking the contract, or sort of trusting that implicitly. And so I think part of the challenge there is just building in that kind of muscle and that expectation into users that hey, make sure that you're kind of doing your diligence here. That because this is permissionless, that risk exists in the same way it does with something like Uniswap. So yeah, I think it's as much of an education and expectation issue as it is anything else.
Yeah, and can you describe the tokenomics a bit more for the Sturdy token?
Yeah, for sure. So right now, the vast majority of the token, I think over 60% is allocated to the treasury, which means that the DAO gets to decide what to do with it. There's a couple of proposals about how exactly the treasury will be allocated over the long term. Right now, it's kind of on an ad hoc basis where there's votes to deploy a certain amount to certain pools. But what in my experience, users want like some kind of long term emission schedule and staking or something like that plays into it. One of the proposals that I've seen is for a VE approach, so where users could stake sturdy to allocate where emissions go between pools. To me, this makes a ton of sense, right? Because there's so many projects, from Curve, Swell, Redacted Similia, Renzo, EtherFi, just to name some of them that have deployed markets on Sturdy that would probably love to see more emissions go to their pools. And so to give them the option to stake Sturdy and vote to allocate it to one pool or another, I think would be a huge benefit to them and something you'd see a lot of projects take advantage of. So yeah, I think that's one of the main proposals that's in the works right now is kind of what the long term emissions will look like.
Hmm. Yeah, I think the VE model is one of the few like sort of tried and true ones we've seen thus far, one of the few tried and true like design principles that seems to benefit DeFi protocols with directable emissions. It's like, tokenomics are hard at the end of the day. To have something that like has been proven to work or has been proven to align incentives the right way for a number of different organizations really is pretty pretty incredible. I want to go back to something you said earlier, going back to like the bit tensor stuff. You alluded to this, and I wanted you to expand on it a little, but I've missed it. So you mentioned that part of like the long term goal for Sturdy is like obviously to leverage this subnet to have the best returns, the best rates for users, but also to serve as that kind of layer for other DeFi protocols as well. Can you expand upon that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So the problem I mentioned of optimal yield allocations, right? That's something that every yield aggregator struggles with. That's something that every lending protocol that has an optimization component, like Morpho, I think Silo's the new version of their protocol has this as well. They all kind of grapple with this problem to some degree. And rather than, we built out that we've spent a bunch of time building out the solution. We'll have this very natural mechanism for solving it soon. And so rather than just, keep that for ourselves, we'd love to have something where everyone's tapping into it, right? And so where they can access either like an API or InfoBridge or Oracle or whatever the method of communication is, to be able to solve that problem using the subnet. I think there's also probably opportunities to expand to other problems of verifiable computation within DeFi, or anything else really that the subnet could take advantage of. So yeah, absolutely. I think over time that's the goal is for this not just to be kind of a sturdy subnet, but a subnet that you could see any DeFi protocol tapping into.
Are any of those use cases like particularly salient to you right now? Are there any that you're really interested in exploring like once you guys have your own DeFi protocol squared away?
Yeah, I mean, I think we'd start with the most direct and close to ours, just from a technical point of view. That makes the most sense. So I mentioned, Yearn has their yield optimizer, right? They have their V3 vaults today. Most of these are managed by either contributors or users who have like created the vaults, and are mostly allocated manually. And so, as an exercise in automation and decentralization, I think this is a perfect place to start. Are other projects that have these automated yield vaults that want to further automate them beyond where they are today? And I think I'm using Yearn as an example, but there are half a dozen to a dozen others, across different chains that pretty much have this identical structure where users deposit to a vault to get automated yields by distributing it to a variety of strategies. There's many billions of dollars right now locked in projects that have that exact structure. And so I think to me, that's kind of the lowest hanging fruit of projects that would be able to take advantage of this subnet.
Yeah, and do you feel like this subnet will be kind of like the main differentiator for you guys, like amongst the competition?
I think it will be one of them. I mean, that's definitely one of the hardest things about standing out in DeFi, where everything's open source. I mean, people will fork you, and our code is open source and public, so that's kind of just part of the game. And certainly, we've used um, you know primitives from other projects. I mentioned we're building on top of your V3 earlier. And so, yeah, I think having just the subnet is definitely a great point of differentiation. And there's a clear moat there, in that there's only 32 of them, and so there's sort of a finite amount there, and it's a little bit harder to fork. So yeah, absolutely. I think totally long term that is one way that Sturdy was going to be able to stand out.
And then I guess like for context, it would also I feel like we have a pretty good pretty good understanding of how that differentiator kind of works, but I think most, or at least me myself, I'm not too familiar with like how some competitors or people offering projects offering similar services kind of operate. So like for Morpho or Yearn, for example, how do they do their aggregation, and what makes it different from your approach?
Yeah, so today it's mostly manual. So both Urine and Morpho, just as examples, have managers, so risk managers or similar roles that holistically look at the vault and decide where to allocate the assets. And I think there will always be room for this kind of strategy for kind of hands-on manual intervention. And there's certainly advantages of that approach too. And so I'm not saying that that's going to go away anytime soon, but yeah, I think for both of those projects, I imagine there would be managers that would love to have a tool or a means to automate it, both to take the operational load off of them, maybe for regulatory reasons that they might perceive this as a little bit better if they're not so hands-on. Of course, in terms of attracting users, I think it's great because the yields are going to be even higher. And so, yeah, over time, having them kind of migrate to using the subnet for all or part of their aggregators or metamorpho vaults or vaults in the case of Yarn, that to me, I think would be great and a big step forward both for us and for them as well.
Yeah, yeah, I can definitely see how that would make a lot of sense. We are coming up on time here a little bit. Would love to as we approach the end here, would love to give you a space as well in case there's anything we missed, anything that you think the users or the the space should know about Sturdy, about what you guys are building, any calls to action you might have. Yeah, just like any closing remarks if you have something like that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think we really hit a lot of the big ticket items. I mean, what I would say for calls to action are for users who are yield farmers who want to earn more points for LRTs, for Eigenlayer, for anything else. I think Sturdy is a great way to do that. I'd also say that if there's an asset that you'd love to borrow against that you think would be super popular, making a governance proposal is a great way to make that happen. And because of the isolated nature, there's really no limit to that. And this can happen pretty quickly in a matter of weeks and hopefully soon with making that permissionless hours. I'd also say that if you're a developer, especially in machine learning or AI or optimization, it'd be great if you could check out the subnet, write your own models. Pretty soon you should be able to actually, make money and make income off of doing that. And yeah, so I think as someone, my background is in CS as a developer, and so we've really tried to design it to make everything as user friendly and developer friendly as possible.
Yeah, the introducing collateral point is really good to know. I think to give like an example or to ask about an example, I'm gonna introduce my bags here a little bit. If I have Easy ETH on ETH mainnet, and I want a place where I can borrow against it on Sturdy, how would that process look for me? How would that governance process look for introducing that proposal?
Yeah, there's actually a proposal for that that's passed and that will be implemented soon. I think, yeah, just in the final stages, both for Easy ETH and yeah, I want to say the Pendle version. I'd have to double check on that. But yeah, but generally speaking, right? Let's say you wanted, some Easy ETH related token on mainnet to borrow against. Um, if you had like sort of a vague idea, you might post to the discussion section, say, "Hey, I want to borrow against this, but I don't really know what the risk parameters should be in terms of the LTV. Maybe I don't know what like the lending or borrowing asset is." People would chime in and say, "Hey, I'd love to borrow USDC against my Easy ETH, or I'd love to borrow ETH or BTC against my Easy ETH." And based on these projects and comparables and the liquidity, I think you should have like a 60% LTV or a 10% liquidation fee or what have you. From there, you would then make a proposal that says, "Hey, we're going to have Easy ETH as collateral. If this proposal passes, here's the parameters, here's the oracle, here's kind of everything in as much detail as you can." Then people might ask you questions about that. about different edge cases or Oracle questions or any details. And then finally, you'd move to a snapshot vote. So then anyone who holds Sturdy can vote on it to approve or reject it. Ideally, though, like I said before, what I'd love to move to is just something on the UI where if you say, "Hey, I want Easy ETH as collateral," you click from a drop down, select Easy ETH, select your parameters, select your lending asset. You get it done in less than an hour. I think that would be super powerful, especially in crypto where you have new stuff launching so frequently, and even a week, while very quick, can feel like a very long time if there's something that you're really excited to borrow against.
Yeah, yeah, I think a future like that would be incredible. I mean, for everyone involved, really. I think part of the like challenge or maybe hesitancy for like some users, or I guess like maybe an average user, is that generally submitting a governance proposal, everything you just outlined right there is like for an average user, that's a lot to consider, right? To set their own parameters, to come up with that stuff. You have to be reasonably savvy. I think you have to kind of be familiar with money markets already. Um, how like how supportive is the DAO throughout that process? If I have like collateral that will generally be a net positive to introduce, and I wanna go and submit a proposal for it, but I'm new to this. I don't know how to go about. I don't know the difference between like 60 and 85% LTV. Are you guys around? Is the DAO generally around to help get that done?
Yeah, definitely. That's really what the discussions are designed for, is to help people narrow down on that. A lot of times, too, the project in question. So let's say for Easy ETH, right, for Renzo, they'll be helping to push that as well, and they've kind of gone through this process before and have a sense of what the parameters should be. So yeah, I think both from the DAO's end and from the project itself, that's the asset belongs to. Both of those will be supportive. To date, I don't think there's ever been a collateral asset that someone suggested that hasn't been like gone through the process and passed, right? Like it's people, because everything's isolated. You don't have the governance drama like you might on other projects where people are really going back and forth because it introduces a systematic risk. So I think that's one thing I really like about that model, is it kind of reduces some of the drama that you typically see associated with DAO governance, especially in lending.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. I myself am. I don't know about Cedo, but I'm not too familiar with some of that drama you're referring to. What's the reference there?
I mean, yeah, there's a lot. The one that actually happened today that's very relevant is on Aave. MakerDAO, you might have seen this. They decided that they're gonna, or I think there's a proposal live to allocate um, DAI to a vault collateralized by Athena's USDE. And there's some people in Aave that feel that that is not prudent. And so their proposal is to make it so that DAI can no longer be used as collateral on Aave. And so, of course, there's people who feel that way, but then there's a lot of people on the other side who maybe they're stakeholders in MakerDAO and who disagree with that. And the challenge is that everyone's either opted in or opted out, right? It's either collateral or it's not for everyone. And the advantage of our model is that you can opt in, right? So if we support DAI as collateral, great. If you want to borrow against DAI, you can. If you want to lend to a pool collateralized by DAI, you can. If you don't want to, you also can. So I mean that one just happened today, but you'll see this very frequently. If you go to the forums of any of these projects that follow this model, where there's a ton of back and forth, that the DAO has to become opinionated. And overall, I don't think that long term it's the solution. I think you'll see other projects like Morpho Blue, and Metamorpho Us, and similar models succeed.
Awesome. Yeah, I think you guys are gonna have a busy few months. I think it's gonna be a, a good time to be involved in Sturdy. I think Ellie might be in the governance proposals trying to get his borrows on his bags. Um, yeah, so I think that just about does it. I really appreciate you for coming on. That is episode 61.
Yeah, thanks for having me.